I was very fortunate this week to be at two teachings that His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave. One was in Manchester, where he was giving a teaching on a Buddhist text and applying his very powerful memory and analytical reasoning and powers of analysis to the text, and it took a lot of concentration to keep up with him, especially through the translator, because he would speak for about 5 minutes and then the translator would have to continue, as Alan knows from having translated for him. But the other day, yesterday I suppose it was, at the Albert Hall with a much larger audience, he taught in a very different way, just by presence, spoke in English. His ideas were very simple, and there was no jargon, no attempt to complicate anything. He had something he wanted to say, and he said it in very simple ways. I think Wittgenstein, the philosopher, said that if something can be said, it can be said simply. And if it cannot be said simply, or briefly maybe he even said, then it should be consigned to silence. Anyway, the Dalai Lama knew what he had to say, and he said it. And as I say, he spoke in a very informal, relaxed way, as we know and love about him. And I thought these are two very different approaches to teaching, but they are complementary. And they showed, how rich and diverse the human mind is, both in the way it communicates and in the way it receives the truth. And so one will suit more people better than another. I'm sure the talk, his presence, his teaching at the Albert Hall yesterday probably touched more hearts and minds, reached a greater number of people, whereas the people listening to him in Manchester who were following him, concentrating, they probably maybe came to a clearer understanding on their own through his analytical and reasoning powers. So there are different approaches to the same mysteries. And as we look at these two words, salvation and enlightenment, I think we need to have a variety of approaches because there is obviously no single and simple definition that will apply to them in all cases. It's not really salvation or enlightenment anyway, as I think we've already established. The two traditions are associated with these two terms, Christianity more with salvation, although not entirely, as I'll suggest in a minute, and Buddhism with enlightenment. But these are different emphasis. This is a different emphasis from each tradition. And if in dialogue, as we consider the similarities and the differences between our two approaches and languages and traditions, vocabularies, I think we can see that these are complementary emphases, and that they can, in fact, illuminate each other very profitably. But let's start with the idea of salvation. I think the word salvation is related to the Sanskrit word sava. Am I pronouncing that correctly? How would you pronounce it? Oh, you're a Sanskrit scholar too? Are you a Sanskrit person as well? It's funny, you have two Sanskrit scholars sitting next to each other. That's unusual. Is it sava? Am I right? Oh. I don't think I'm going to let you continue it, because No, go. What would be the word for... No, salvation... The word sava, I understood... Yeah, it's the root word. It gives us salutary or salubrious. It means whole, doesn't it? Thank you, I'm right. Goodness. It would be a very short talk otherwise. Thank you. I'll learn not to ask an expert at the beginning of a talk. So it's a root word in Sanskrit which means all or everything or whole, wholeness or health. So gives us the word salubrious or salutary, something that promotes health. So salvation we approach, I think, essentially in Christian terms, not so much in the idea of being saved from an imminent disaster or saved from hell, but the word itself suggests an introduction to or a being led into wholeness, into health, into flourishing, the eudaimonia, as Alan was saying earlier. And I think this is something maybe Christians need to wrestle with a little bit, because we carry a lot of baggage connected with terms like this that have been misunderstood or misused over time. And I'll quote an ancient Christian idea, adage, which will make some of you quiver. There is no salvation outside the church. And it gets even worse. There is no salvation outside the church because the church is salvation. Exactly. So what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean what I think we project onto it. Because in fact, the Church, the Catholic Church, in her wisdom, has excommunicated people, priests, who have said, this means that you have to be in the church, a baptized, card-carrying, baptismal certificate brandishing Catholic in order to be saved. So not only did the institutional church, if you like, reject that interpretation, it actually rejected it with its strongest possible sanction. So this phrase is something we can come back to. It's a touchy phrase, but I introduce it just to wake you up in the afternoon. It comes from the 3rd century, from St. Cyprian, a long time before the church is split in this way. But the meaning, I think, is different from what might be hijacked from it by a fundamentalist. It means that in a mysterious way, everyone experiences salvation. Everyone is saved. It also means that no one is saved alone. We're not saved in a privatized kind of salvation, just me and my God alone and everybody else waiting outside, but that we are only saved in an incorporate way. We're incorporated with all that is and all other beings, all other creatures, in this salvation which God wills. God created, saw all that he created was good, and he didn't go away and leave us to our own devices. As the Bible expresses through its stories, God accompanies humanity in its pilgrimage into higher consciousness, and wills the well-being of humanity. Now, that's a very different language from one that the Buddhists would use, and it presupposes a God who not only creates, but also a God who wills something and wants something and is watching over things. And that, again, is a language that we have to use and hold mindfully, carefully, intelligently. But this adage, I think, teaches us something about the universal meaning of salvation. It also may tell us something about what the church means, that the church is not only to be understood as a power base or an institution, but it can also be seen, as in fact I think many of us would understand, as a mystical body, transcending the limits of culture and time and space, a transhistorical mystical reality that is associated with one or more institutions and different forms of the tradition, but is constantly renewing itself from its mystical nature. So no one can be saved, can come into fullness of being in an isolated or independent, privatized way. And in fact, salvation is written into the very nature of things. Things tend towards completion. Everything that exists, like the roses that are budding around us at the moment and the flowers that are growing and the whole process of nature, everything, including the human species, is moving towards some kind of flourishing, salvation, wholeness, health, fullness and completeness. The Church, therefore, can be seen in this understanding, from a Christian point of view, as the interdependence of all things in some kind of mystical web, and that it is that our own flourishing occurs within this web of unity. So the model here, the metaphor here, is not one of the law, but one of medicine. To be saved doesn't mean that you are let off a crime that you have committed, or in the popular but misleading metaphor of redemption, that Christ paid a debt to the Father for the sin of humanity, and only the infinite merit of his sacrifice was able to satisfy that debt, a kind of IMF, Greek island and Portugal kind of way. So that God becomes some kind of Bundesbank, which is providing infinite resources, but you have to do it from within the euro. So you have to do it from within the Trinity itself. So I think this model is very, even young children reject this model because it doesn't correspond with the other information they're hearing about God, which is that God is loving and forgiving and will always take care of you. But if you don't go to Mass on Sunday, you will go to hell for the rest of your existence. So even a child recognizes that these are conflicting metaphors, although many children, of course, are not given the opportunity to express that or to question it, or weren't in the past. Most of us here would have had this kind of conditioning, but I think younger children today might not. So in any case, the model here is not a legal model, but one of healing, and of a healing process corresponding to what Alan was saying about the work we have to do on our imperfect condition. This is how we begin. Who's perfect? Who hasn't got some problems? Whoever we blame for them, or however we understand these problems, whether we blame our parents or our government or our genes, we all know that we have imperfections, and that if we want to flourish, then we have to work on these problems. That is the purgative way. That's why there is work to be done in purifying mind and heart and establishing good habits over bad habits. I'll come back to this in a moment, because I think these are what I would call the tools of enlightenment. So I'll give my thesis at the beginning, that we need tools of enlightenment. Enlightenment is the process. The goal is this condition of wholeness, health, flourishing, eternal life is the common term, or fullness of life. Jesus himself was seen in this way by the early Christians as they reflected upon the mystery that they had encountered through the person of Jesus. Jesus himself refers to himself as a physician on at least two occasions, as a healer. And the Gospels are full of stories of him healing the sick, the blind, the lame, the deaf, lepers, the paralyzed, the mentally ill. In Mark chapter 1, when the lepers come to Jesus, he touches the leper, an act that made him ritually impure. He excluded himself from his own comfort zone, from his own rule system by touching the leper, but what an extraordinary act of compassion and connection. And his healing powers were not restricted to the physical level, but often reintegrated the sick person into their community, sent them back into society, so that they could find this measure of salvation within their own social group. Frequently, when he performs these miracles of healing, he attributes the power of the healing not to anything within himself, in fact, but to the faith of the person who has been healed. And what I was saying earlier in my response to Alan about faith, I think is relevant here. Faith is this capacity we have for commitment through the power of attention. We give ourselves. Faith is really this power we have of giving ourselves away, of giving ourselves to another person, of giving ourselves to a worthwhile work. And so faith, operating through the power of attention, which is another word for love in effect, we are healed. Go in peace, your faith has healed you, Jesus says. And in fact, even on one occasion when he's in Nazareth, the gospel writer tells us he could not perform any miracles there because of their lack of faith. So Jesus himself refers to his healing gift or his healing work as an expression, not as the basis of faith in him, but as an expression of why he is there. It is not the healthy who need a physician, he says, it is the sick. So I think the sickness, the physical sicknesses, the physical and mental illnesses that he has shown healing in the Gospels are, in a sense, metaphors, active metaphors, just as our body is a kind of a metaphor of our mind and spirit. So these were metaphors, ways of understanding the human condition, that imperfect human condition, the fact that we don't start with a clean slate, really, even. That we start with certain handicaps, certain predispositions, whether genetic or psychological or inherited, and that these demand treatment. These are things that we can't leave untreated because they will get worse. In our work with children, meditation with children, I learned that the vast majority of mental illness in adults that occurs increasingly and becoming increasingly manifest, say, after the age of 20, in your 30s and into your 40s and even later, the vast majority of these forms of mental illness show their first symptoms before the age of 14. And therefore, intervention should be done as soon as possible. Teaching children to meditate quite clearly is a positive intervention. I mean, nobody has ever said in all the years that we've been teaching meditation in schools, neither children nor teachers nor parents, that it has not had beneficial results. It is so obvious. It's like a sunny day, unless you're really pessimistic and miserable. If you see a beautiful sunny day, you don't go out and say, oh, what a horrible day. It's just natural to enjoy and appreciate the benefits that it brings us. So we're approaching, I hope, an understanding of salvation in Christian thought that is less legalistic, less conditioned by its opposite, which is damnation, and more and emphasizing much more the role of health of soul and body. Apatheia in the desert tradition was called the health of the soul, and the work of meditation, especially work of prayer in all its forms, but especially the pure prayer of meditation, brings apatheia, brings health to the soul. So if this is our approach fundamentally to the idea of salvation, I think we can see that Jesus is a savior. There are many mythical saviors in the human imagination. Chiron, the Greek centaur, who was the master of the arts of healing, is a kind of Christ-like mythical figure. He was immortal, but was shot with a wounded arrow and therefore suffered. But even while he suffered and couldn't die, he continued to teach the arts of healing. And his final gift of self was the surrender of his immortality. In order, he traded his immortality for the life of Prometheus, who was also in a bad way. And so Chiron surrendered his immortality, went up and became a constellation in the sky, and Prometheus continued his work of human ingenuity. So we can see the idea of a savior is deeply embedded in the human imagination, together with the idea of self-sacrifice, the offering of oneself. I was interested that Alan was speaking a lot from the Christian tradition and quoting the Augustinian theology, and I, not knowing that he was going to do that, had been reading Shantideva. And I was just reminded, of course, he actually translated the text I was reading from. But Shantideva, what was Shantideva's dates? 7th and 8th century. So Shantideva wrote a wonderful little book called A Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life. A bodhisattva is somebody who achieves enlightenment, could just rest on his or her laurels and enjoy the fruits of their spiritual practice, but restrain themselves, as it were, from entering into full bliss, and I don't know if this is how I should put it, and remains in the human realm in order to continue to alleviate human suffering. St. Paul says something very much like this when he says, I would willingly go to hell in order for you to be saved, writing in one of his letters, perfect bodhisattva ideal. And the Dalai Lama actually expressed the same thing, I think unknowingly, yesterday in the Abertoir, when he was talking about the idea of hell, and he said, I don't know, maybe what did he say? He said, maybe I will have to go to hell, but even if I'm in hell, he said, I will still be thinking of you. I will still be, hoping for you to be better, the world to be a better place. So this is very deeply embedded, I think, in the human spiritual imagination. It comes through the scriptures consistently. And in Shantideva, there's a verse, maybe Alan can address this later, which has always fascinated me. I think it's in chapter 8 of the guide on meditation. If by one person's suffering, this is Shantideva, the 8th century Buddhist teacher, if by one person's suffering, the suffering of many would be destroyed, surely kind-hearted people would accept it for the sake of themselves and others. Thus because he loves to pacify the pains of others, he whose mind is attuned this way would enter even the deepest hell, just as a wild goose plunges into a lotus pool. And then I think at the end of that section, there's an even further Christian or Christocentric resonance. I mean, quite clearly Christians here would remember the image of Jesus descending into hell and the cross as an offering of himself for the salvation of others. Okay, this is the eradication of karma at some important level. And there is an incorporation of this act, this bodhisattva act of salvation and indeed of redemptive suffering of humanity with Jesus. And this incorporation, I think, is expressed here, or anyway, it strikes me as resonating with it in Shantideva. Why should I be unable to regard the bodies of others as I? Why should I be unable to regard the bodies of others as I, as me? Hence it is not difficult to see that my body is also that of others. Well, that's certainly a basis for a dialogue between Christianity and Buddhism on the theme of Christ as Savior, somebody who offered his life for the well-being of others. The death and the suffering of Jesus express a redemptive concentration of the power of karma, that we can carry each other's burdens. Take upon yourself the sins of others, the sufferings of others, the faults of others, the handicaps of others, the problems of others. Anything that prevents another person from flourishing, whether it is fear or guilt or a psychological problem or an addiction or a radical sense of inferiority or inadequacy, whatever prevents someone from coming into the fullness of their own being, we can. And this seems to me the message or the lesson of the gospel in this respect. We can, not just Jesus, but we can, as alter Christi, other Christs, we can carry or help to carry their burden. That is redemptive. Those of you who may be caring for sick relatives, some of you may be here on a day off, the rest of the time you're at home looking after a sick relative. Well, you know what that means, those of you who are raising children and remaining faithful to the children as they go through their problems and difficulties. So I think this idea of salvation and its connection with some form of karma releasing or karma dissolving redemptive suffering, taking on the suffering of others, seems to me to take us into a truer meaning of salvation than just the sort of the legalistic model. So we can carry each other's burdens. We can take the rap even for each other. We can serve those who are suffering with us. Etty Hillesum, who was a young Jewish woman in Amsterdam during the time when the Nazis were rounding up the Jews for extermination, chose not to be swept away by the emotions that had mastered most of her, understandably enough, most of her fellow Jews, which was a hatred of the Germans for doing what they were doing. She certainly didn't approve of it, but she decided not to allow herself to hate them. And she told her fellow Jews, that this was not a positive way to go. It wasn't going to do them any good. And one of them said to her, "Well, that sounds very like Christianity to me." And her response, "So what? Whether it's Christianity or not, it's true. It's accurate." And she'd found it. She had found God in herself. Whether it was a Jewish God or a Christian God, I don't think we know. But she had found God within herself. She even identified it eventually as God and even addressed it as you, because this was the best way she could relate to the experience, the truth that she had discovered. And she devoted herself joyfully, not without much suffering and occasional moments of real depression and despair, but devoted herself tirelessly simply to relieving the physical and mental suffering of the people she was living with and working for. So this is a possibility. And this is deeply embedded, I think, in the Christian idea of salvation, not as something that comes to us from the outside only, and something we receive passively, and we don't have to do anything more about it except to obey the rules of the church and live a good life and just sort of sneak in quietly. But it's something that empowers us to do the same ourselves. In a sense, we have to bring salvation to others. If we realize what salvation means, and if we know that we are saved, I mean, that's a terrible phrase to many of you. If we know that we are saved, in other words, if we know that we have this capacity for wholeness, for flourishing, then we've got something, we are empowered by something. We can do something for others, take the tension off ourselves, stop moaning, stop complaining. Sounds a hard thing to say, but I was speaking once to one of our oblates, actually, in Australia, who's a woman called Mari O'Leary, who's very housebound and has a multitude of physical conditions, causes her to live in constant pain. And she is an indefatigable meditator, and she struggles every day. But I interviewed her once. It's on our YouTube channel if you want to look at it. I interviewed her once and asked her, I said, what would you say to... I said, how do you meditate with all this pain? She said, well, I just meditate. Just have to do it. Otherwise the pain just overwhelms me. And so I said, what advice would you give to people who say, you can't do it? I said, keep trying. Simple as that. I wouldn't dare say that, but listen to what she says. So, whatever our own condition, if we have to some degree anyway tasted what salvation means, we are, I think, capable of being of value to other people, to bring salvation to other people. Now, the death and the suffering of Christ, which are focal points in his life for the understanding of salvation, seem to me to be the concentration of the imperfections the concentration of the shadow side, if you like, the dark side of the soul. And this dark side of the soul, as we can read every day in the newspaper, has its roots not only in personal tendencies, individual subjective conditions, the tendency towards selfishness or anger or illusion or exploitation or lust or pride or greed, all the things that we know makes the world an unhappy place. But it may be rooted even deeper than the personal level, in the deepest and most inarticulate levels of our own evolutionary heritage. So it's that part of us that has yet to evolve. I can't say any more about it than that, but that these tendencies are as yet not fully humanized, natural parts of our evolutionary heritage. And salvation consists in bringing these as yet non-humanized tendencies, the tendency, for example, to take from another person what you need, even if the other person needs it too, or needs it more than you. To humanize that tendency would be to be able to give to the, or at least to share with the other person, whatever it may be, or to allow the other person to have it. And I think we would all agree that represents a higher level of humanity. It's a more exemplary and a more inspiring kind of human being who does that. Concentrating this shadow side of us, what we could call sin, because sin is whatever blocks our full development, not just through breaking man-made rules, being naughty or socially unconventional, but sin here representing some kind of blockage, or maybe even some kind of gravitational pull backwards into earlier stages of our evolution, through parts of ourselves. This is not the whole person, for most of us anyway. There are individuals in which this gravitational pull backwards seems to have mastered them completely, as far as we can see. But for most of us, we feel a kind of a conflict. As St. Paul says, what I want to do, I do not do. What I do not want to do, I find myself doing. I'm in this divided state. And what comes to heal this divided state, to bring salvation, healing, salve, the ointment, is grace. Where sin is, grace abounds all the more. Now, there is something I'd like to talk about with Alan, and from a Buddhist perspective. Why should it be so confidently that St. Paul says, and he had his own breakthrough because he'd had his enlightenment moment too, why should he say so clearly and confidently that where there is sin, what corresponds to sin in the Christian vision is not punishment. Sin is its own punishment. But what corresponds to sin is grace. And in fact, the deeper the sin, the greater the grace. That's what he says. So, we could see that in Jesus, in the death and the cross, the suffering and death of Jesus, some kind of concentration of this dark side took place in an individual, certainly. But, it's why St. Paul also says, he became sin for our sake. So he became sin. He was so absorbed, as it were, in this negative or blockage state that he became sin. The concentration of the shadow is evil, of course, what we call evil. Enlightenment is the process of higher evolution that can only happen when these lower and darker forces have been made conscious, have been confronted and overcome. This is what the Buddha went through in the night of his enlightenment, when he was battered and bruised by all the forces of negative forces of his mind. The teaching of the Buddha emphasizes the inner mental aspects of this process of enlightenment. So, in order to be enlightened, we have first of all to face the dark. We know from St. John that the light shines in the dark, and the darkness has never overwhelmed it. So it's an inextinguishable light. And it is life. This is the light of life. And its roots and origins take us back beyond the horizon of human understanding into the mystery of God, who is life. This is where life comes from. Now, the teaching of the Buddha, it seems to me, emphasizes this inner mental process by which we have to confront this darkness. The teaching of Jesus is not inconsistent with that in any way. I don't think I found anything in Buddhism that is of this kind that is inconsistent with the Christian understanding. But the teaching of Jesus emphasizes more the interpersonal aspects of the journey to enlightenment. Quite simply, love your neighbor. What is the first commandment? Love the Lord your God, your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole strength, and your neighbor as yourself. These three aspects or three dimensions of love. The Buddha, you might say, says, know yourself, see reality as it is. Jesus says, love your neighbor, leave self behind, give yourself. As teachings on the path of enlightenment, they are, of course, complementary. And following the emphasis of one will inevitably open you to the complementary experience as well. After all, you cannot follow a Buddhist path without discovering compassion. And you can't follow the love of enemies that Jesus recommends, the love of neighbor, without discovering your own ego and discovering your own dark side and the need to confront that. So, to follow this path is to accept our own humanity in all its facets, in its full significance, and to overcome the temptation to settle for what we've got, however incomplete it is. This is a refrain you find in John Main's teaching quite often. Came from his own very deep experience of flourishing, of enlightenment, and it led him to a certain, partly impatience, but really more what's the word? A sort of deep urgency to remind people not to settle for second best, not to remain stuck where you are, that we are called beyond our present level of development. And however stuck you feel, there is a way forward. Both Christian, in terms of practice, in terms of meditation, in terms of self-control, in terms of how we have to deal with our own shadow side, Buddhism and Christianity, certainly through the monastic traditions, are perfectly aware that there is no enlightenment without struggle with this force of regressive darkness. We all have tendencies to be lazy, to be greedy, to wallow in our fear or to indulge in violence, verbally or otherwise. So there is no process of enlightenment without struggle. And in fact, you could almost say the process of enlightenment is this struggle. It is in overcoming these obstructions or this sin, these different manifestations of sin, that we become enlightened. The cross shows the concentration of this darkness in a very vivid and unforgettable image of an innocent victim, but it also shows the mysterious action of grace. And this, again, it seems to me, is something Buddhism and Christianity can explore together from different perspectives. Grace, God's love for us. The love I speak of, St. John says, is not our love for God, but God's love for us because he loved us first. In the film, many of you perhaps have seen Into Great Silence. Did you see that? It's a 4-hour silent film set in the Grande Chartreuse. I must admit I slept through the first 15 minutes of it, and I'd gone and had dinner and a glass of wine before. But then when I woke up, I was held by it. And it wasn't a documentary about this particular monastic life, it was just observing it. And with some wonderful photography and character studies. And at the end, and it became a cult all over, I don't know about it, was it in North America too? It became a real cult film. And throughout all secular Western Europe, people were lining up to go to see it. And I wondered what was the attraction of it. Part of it, I think, was the fact it was simply showing another way of life, and everybody is interested in living differently, that we could live a different way, not necessarily by going into a monastery, but there's a choice we have to live as we wish. And secondly, it seemed to me it was speaking about God, and yet it never mentioned God. And there was no proselytizing, no preaching. I mean, you might have asked yourself, what are these men doing here? It seemed to be, they didn't really explain why they were there, but it was obvious why they were there. And then I suddenly realized that actually, you don't see God's name in the credits, but God was there in every scene, in every look, and in every interaction, every moment. The concentration of the powers of darkness, that's what happens in the cross, leads to an explosion of light. And that is the resurrection, the clear light of the mind of Christ, shining into the human realm and felt by all, named by many, recognized by a few perhaps, but spreading unconditionally, in the Christian understanding, to believers and non-believers alike. The other idea of a salvation is that it is restricted to a few, has characterized Christianity for a long time, but it isn't, anyway, certainly the teaching of most Christian leaders or of the Catholic Church at the moment. Quite the reverse. The Church, for example, is seen as a sign of the salvation of the world, not the club you have to belong to in order to be saved. Very big difference. And how that relates to the idea of a Buddhist Sangha is another matter. What it means that we can see Christ in the Dalai Lama is another challenge to contemporary Christian theology. And in the Vatican Council document says that in some mysterious way, this saving work of Christ has touched every human person. And that little phrase is all important, in some mysterious way. Now, this is Christian thought. This is an attempt of the Christian reflecting upon their own faith tradition and their own experience to try. I don't think we have it. What I've said isn't the final definition, but I'm interested in trying to push this further along. The clear light of the mind of Christ is a direct reflection, purposefully directed, of the Father who dwells in unapproachable light. This is the light, the clear light mind of Buddhism. The nature of the mind is luminous. The Father, whom Jesus refers to, and to whom Jesus defers to. When the Dalai Lama was once asked at the Good Heart Seminar, if you could meet Jesus, what question would you ask him? Sister Eileen O'Hay asked him that question. And quick as a shot, he said, I would ask him, what is the nature of the Father? So, that's our question. What would any Christian say is the nature of the Father? Meister Eckhart has his explanation. This Godhead, as it were, the ground of being, behind and before every image or model of God that we can imagine, there is this infinite regress of the mystery, of the unknowable. But it is light. This is the light that blinded St. Paul on the road to Damascus. A clear light mind in Buddhism is the most subtle level of mind. Now here again is another area of debate or conversation with the Buddhists perhaps. I think in Buddhism, this clear light mind experience, the most subtle level of mind, is seen as belonging only to the most advanced practitioners or in the death process. But what if it has become closer? What if it has, and maybe we're seeing signs of this sociologically and historically, what if it, with more people meditating, with more people, still only a relatively small number, but nevertheless an increasing number of people who are seriously engaged in the work of enlightenment on the road to salvation, who are in touch, as it were, with this clear light, or see it closer. In the letter of James, a very Buddhist letter in the New Testament, he speaks about the appetites, the human appetites that lead to conflict, the desire that leads to violence, the love of the world, he says, that leads to enmity with God. Well, again, in this understanding of salvation and enlightenment, this isn't just moralistic. It's not just about how you behave. It is about how you are, how much you are engaged in overcoming these obstructions, healing these divisions within yourself. So the love of the world could be translated as attachment. And enmity with God could be translated, I don't know, as some spiritual blockage. If you're locked into these conditions of mind and behavior, then you are not moving into the clear light. You're not getting any closer to this clear light. So, I'll just bring this to a conclusion, I suppose. The word for enlightenment in Christianity was photismos, light, like photography, photismos, and writing with light. And photismos was originally associated with the experience of conversion or metanoia, that turning point in our life, or turning points in our life, where we change direction, where we actually commit ourselves to something different and begin to live and act differently. By the 2nd or 3rd century, the word photismos was also being associated very much with baptism. Not only the ritual of baptism, but also the preparation for it, and the change of life that began with your incorporation into the Christian Sangha, Christian community. Later, I think this meaning became very restricted, so it led to the rather absurd understanding of enlightenment, that it was phatismos came through the ritual when you were an infant, and if you didn't get it, you wouldn't go to heaven, and you were excluded from salvation. But that is a very crass and a very inaccurate rendering. It's a distortion. It's a sort of a real distortion, or perversion even, of the original teaching of Christian enlightenment. What links salvation and enlightenment is grace, I think. Grace builds on nature. I must say, for myself, the more I meditate, the less preoccupied I am, or less interested I am, or even the less I believe, in a way, in the supernatural. I can't get my head around the supernatural very well anymore. I believe that grace is constantly present. God is. Grace is another word for how we experience God. Grace is another word for how we experience God's presence. But grace works within the natural world. And how else can we understand that? We are part of this natural world. Everything about us is part of this natural world. So grace works in us, whether it's mentally, physically, or spiritually, on the nature that we have. And it is through that working of grace on our human nature that we are empowered to continue with the work of the practices of enlightenment, our prayer, and the practice. So many of the practices of Buddhism and Christianity are complementary. Many of these forms of prayer are very complementary. They make sense across the tradition, the divides or the space between the two traditions. And it's grace that both moves us into these practices, I would say. Somebody's got to turn the ignition, something or other has got to start us pushing. But it is also grace which comes or increases and expands as a result of these practices. So grace is the fuel, really, that keeps the journey of enlightenment going, and maybe we could even say that state of final flourishing, that of salvation, the vision of God, the complete divinization of our humanity within the life of God, that is simply grace abundant, grace without any limitation. Well, I think I'll cut short there and ask Alan to come and join us.